On today's World Insight, the fifth session of the United Nations Environment Assembly convenes this week. What can be done to ensure humanity inherits a green future? And Myanmar's military leaders face striking civil servants and overseas sanctions. Is there still time for a peaceful resolution between the protesters and the military? Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. From species extinction to extreme weather, the planet is in crisis. Hosted by the United Nations Environment Program, or UNEP, the fifth session of the United Nations Environment Assembly meets this week. World leaders, scientists, businesses, and civil society convene to address some of the most pressing environmental issues facing our planet, such as the role the nature plays in sustainable development and how strategic green COVID-19 recovery plans can accelerate the transition to an inclusive, prosperous, low carbon, and healthier nature. To explore many of these very sophisticated issues, let's loop in our panelists to hear their analysis. For more on the United Nations Environment Assembly, in Boston, we are joined by Maria Ivanova, Associate Professor of Global Governance and Graduate Program Director from the University of Massachusetts in Boston. And in New York, we are joined by Pradeep Kulasuriya. I hope I pronounced your name right, sir. Executive Coordinator and Director at the Global Environmental Finance from the United Nations Development Program, also known as UNDP. In Beijing, last but not least, Ma Jun, Director of the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs and founder of the Blue Map app. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the program. Well, long expected, this Environment Assembly this year is likely to focus on the relationship between nature and also human being. Pradeep, tell me more from the UN perspective. What can be achieved?
No, it's an important question. The 30th anniversary of the Human Development Report was actually titled The Next Frontier, Human Development and the Anthropocene. And the research that was conducted indicated that human development levels have actually projected to fall. And why is this important? This is important for the entire UN system because it's going to require governments and partners in every country, communities faced with these urgent needs to halt the spread of the virus while responding to the unprecedented socioeconomic crisis that it has generated. And UNEA is an important platform for the entire UN system to actually galvanize around the topics that really have to be tackled, which are interconnectedness between nature, economic growth, and also addressing the issues of the pandemic.
Professor Ivanova, it sounds abstract though. And therefore very hard for common folks to understand exactly what this meeting can achieve. Will it become one of those meetings of empty talks?
Without these meetings, without talks, we cannot get to any collective decision.
So what can be talked at this time? Eventually, what will be the outcome, do you think people are expecting?
So, by the way, this meeting of UNEA is UNEA 5.1, only 2.5 days of virtual meetings. So what can we achieve virtually with all 193 governments in the same virtual Zoom room? We could achieve a common collective narrative, perhaps. But what we could also achieve is to launch the 50th anniversary of UNEP.
Can I follow up on the common collective narrative? What is the lowest barometer and the highest barometer for folks like you who are in the field for years looking at? What would be claimed as a success if this narrative can be formed? What should be included in that narrative? Maria?
Two things: individual responsibility and collective responsibility.
Explain.
Individually, we have to decide what are we responsible for our consumption. The collective responsibility is the one by governments, by states, whether as one government or collectively. And that is exactly what they're doing at UNEA, of what are the regulations, the laws, the consumption patterns and production patterns that governments can decide on together.
It has been long expected that meetings like this should be held and a common narrative, as the other two scholars have illustrated, should be formed. And yet we've been having some hiccups, to say the least, over the past few years about international governance, including about environmental issues, biodiversity, and climate change. Now, it seems that the environment has been changed somewhat. How optimistic are you, Jun? Tell me more about that this common narrative can be formed, and will it be sustainable or only comes with political cycles in different countries?
Yeah, I think that now, we have been wasting 4 years of time, during this process. During this period of time, we only see the, climate change risks getting higher, and also the impact on the biodiversity has not been mitigated because of that. So now, finally, I think during the past 4 years, we have, meetings after meetings of international negotiation and discussion. We have seen that anything related to green and to climate almost cannot be very much discussed intergovernmentally the course of the Trump administration's opposition. But now, finally, I think we have seen the global climate governance moving back to its normalcy. We hope that the COP meeting held in that is projected to be held in Kunming will also bring the biodiversity agenda back to normal.
It is not just a political issue. It is really an issue of reality. That developed economies have been taking advantage of pollution, but developing countries are at a different development stage, particularly now with the pandemic threat. Many of their economies are very much challenged. The debts being built up and many other things related. So Pradeep, just frankly speaking, are there help provided to the global south in this regard in terms of, climate change issues of biodiversity protection?
No, it is incredibly important, because if you think about it, by 2030, we're expecting 1 billion people who could be living in extreme poverty, a quarter of them as a result of the pandemic, unless we act now. Half of the world is struggling to make ends meet right now without social protection, like unemployment benefits, healthcare. We do need to change the paradigm under which we work. And that means both, ensuring that finance flows to countries that most need it, but also leveraging the huge amount of domestic and private sector finance that is already there, but needs to be directed towards the kinds of investments that we need for the future. This requires essentially focusing on those elements that's preventing this capital to go where it needs to go, de-risking, reducing the risks associated with capital flows. I mean, this is incredibly important today, and a lot more needs to be done on that front.
The power outage in Texas has been the headline story for the world. And now people are looking at, how is this interest being, articulated by all stakeholders, and whether, this will be the beginning of solving a problem in the U.S. about what to do for the energy sector and many other issues involved. Maria, tell me more about what's the latest analysis you have about incidents like this, and what does it have to do with our overall blueprint that we are talking about today?
So I'm in Boston, but I'm originally from Bulgaria. I'm from a small state. And I think in your bigger analysis here, small state diplomacy is absolutely critical, and understanding the issues, the interests of smaller states. And now when we look at the concerns in the United States, and the states here, right, like Texas or California or Florida, are getting a very different sense of what it is to be living in climate change reality. And so I see that there is a need to reconsider what is happening in the world, both from the state perspective in the United States context, but also from that state perspective in the international context of small states versus large states. You mentioned just a few minutes ago, how can we play if the big players are not in the game? We can't. However, the small players have to continue, and they will continue. And you see small state diplomacy and small state championship absolutely critical. We would not have had the Paris Climate Agreement had it not been for the Marshall Islands, as well as the United States and China. And so I think that now, and to come back to UNEA, where we started the conversation, this is the arena where small and big states come together and where we could articulate that collective narrative of mutual responsibility and accountability that we so need right now.
You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Back in 2019, I had a chance to speak to Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Program, Inger Andersen. She told me how UNEP have done in tackling the lack of global governance. Let's listen in to what she had to say then. UNEP's role, Ms. Andersen, has been warning the world about the house on fire. But even after repeated warning, you do not see governments coordinate in the best way.
Well, we've been warning about the house being on fire because it is. In a sense, we've been taking nature for granted. We've assumed that we can put things into the atmosphere, consume and discard our wastes, our carbon, into the atmosphere in such a way that nature would continue to absorb it, that the atmosphere would continue to absorb it, which it will not. We have at the same time in all countries massive commitments at the country level, at the city level, at the state level, at the industry level, at the science level. So it's a complex world we live in. And I think if we assume that the world is on a linear path, we have been mistaken. This is hard. It's actually not even an assumption, it's a fact. This is hard. And it being hard, therefore, there will be interest. But here's the thing, it's a complex situation, but we must understand, and that's why Paris highlights, leave no one behind. And in some countries we did leave some people behind. We did not take into account the fact that we needed to make sure that we need to lift people out of poverty, we needed to create jobs for everybody, and the transition is complex.
I know you're an optimist because you have to be, and you really need to be in your mission. But at the same time, may I, Ms. Andersen, remind you of the reality that we are struggling with the priorities in the world. Geopolitics, for example, lack of future plan of global governance have made all of us dizzy in a way. So whether environmental protection, climate change will remain on top of the list as the priority as they were 5 years ago, for example, it's a big question mark.
Unfortunately, I would say it is not a question mark, because if we don't prioritize it, climate will come knocking on everybody's door.
But we always want to be firefighters. We never want to think ahead. That's the human nature too.
But you see, the point here is now we are already firefighting. As I said, the house is on fire. And when you are in the fire with these increasingly hard hits by nature, then we will stay committed.
You're also dealing with a house when the institutions are being questioned and being tumbled. It's not just the...
No, the institutions are not being questioned or tumbled. It's normal that people leave, they get other opportunities, they may get sick. It's a normal situation. The good thing is we are 7 billion plus on this good planet. There are plenty of good people. If I leave my job, there are plenty of good people who can come in my place. Because the UN is strong. We are turning 75 next year. We have been around for a long time, and so we are not going anywhere because member states are committed. So personalities might change, but our mission, our mandate, which is given to us by member states, is given. And it's difficult, it's complicated, there are different views, geopolitics, But there's only one way we can deal with it, and that is a multilateral platform. That is the United Nations, and that's what I work for.
Jen, there were a lot of skepticism in the air earlier when China was talking about carbon neutral and carbon zero. Now, there are specific blueprints being drawn out at this moment when we speak. Now, how optimistic are you given the latest incidents, both of the pandemic and the lack of a recovery steam of the global economy for a country like China?
Yeah, I can understand the skepticism because it was pretty gloomy, and upset prior to the pledge made by President Xi last September on carbon neutrality in China. When it comes to climate issues, because of all the headwinds that we're facing, socio-economically. Having said that, this is unexpected, and some of the pathways toward zero carbon is not actually that clear, especially when it comes to very highly energy intensive industries like iron, steel, like cement. It was not that clear, but China still made this bold commitment, and people first, people are happy, but then, there are also questions raised. So at this moment, it's very encouraging to see that not just internationally, other countries started following, when big players like China joined the game, but also within China, most important, within China, there's a kind of a new dynamic developed. There was a kind of almost like an emergency, the emergency adjustment made to the 14th five-year plan to integrate so many factors in terms of low carbon. And at this moment, the most important for us is to break this 40-year commitment into phases, into milestones that we can achieve, and also distribute the target to different regions and to different industries and emitters.
Very interesting to me how the air in Beijing, for example, in Shanghai, for example, in Canton, for example, got much better. If you travel to China these days, the blue sky will count for the majority rather than the minority, unlike a few years ago. So, Jun, what exactly happened? Can China still keep that record and make it even better?
I think, that is the not just a achievement that we should celebrate for the for the protection of the health of the Chinese people. When the PM 2.5, the fine particles concentration level in Beijing dropped from nearly 90 micrograms annual average to just 38 last year. In just, from 2013 to last year. But also this is by itself a huge contribution to the global fighting against climate change, because prior to 2013, our coal consumption had been tripled in just 11, 12 years of time. But ever since then, it has got stagnated, basically still not surpassed the peak in 2013. So I think this is by itself a huge contribution. But having said that, we're still burning half of the world's coal, and China's carbon emission is well beyond 10 billion tons. That's why it's so important for us to recognize this reality and started taking massive action to try to transform, our energy mix, and of course to transform our industrial structure.
Pradeep, how do you see that? Is that an interesting example? Are there other interesting examples in the world that could be of inspirations? Let's just say, in order to create that common narrative all of you touched on.
Yeah, I think we can think a little bit about IEA's recent sustainable development scenario, which offered a pathway for the global energy system to reach where it needs to go, and that involves a three-step strategic goal. One is to make sure the Paris Agreement goals are met. Another is to ensure universal access to energy. And then thirdly, substantially reducing air pollution. We have to remember that we need to cut emissions by a very high and steep rate by 2030 if we are going to make these targets come alive. And that's a difficult task, but it can be done. And one of the things I think we have to do is to essentially transition away from fossil fuel subsidies, which is incredibly critical to achieve the Paris targets. And right now, we're not getting there. We see significant amount of fossil fuel subsidies still being applied, when in fact we should be already transitioning away from that. And a critical element in that is to reprice energy to truly reflect its true cost. And that requires essentially one, removing or at least reducing these subsidies, and secondly, to introduce a carbon price that is sufficiently high to change the investment trajectory.
We've seen a new generation, very concerned about climate change issues, very much for biodiversity, very much looking at the nature, its relationship with human being. But we also see this is the generation that's going to be impacted tremendously by pandemic, by the lack of esteem for economic recovery post-pandemic. By the way, we don't even know when that's going to happen post-pandemic at this moment. So how are we going to see the priority struggling of topics and attentions and financial support in the world in terms of policy making and also in terms of public consensus? Maria.
I see, on the one hand, this new generation emerging with the aspirations and with commitments to make change. And at the same time, I feel how absolutely dramatically impacted our students are.
Yeah.
And so issues of equity are absolutely critical. So we have committed to equity and wellness at the same time. And honestly, we cannot have the same narrative as in the 1970s of the doom and gloom, and we have to resolve this problem because the end will come. Yeah. I see how young people of today are inspired by what they can do, of what their responsibility is, but also how they can trigger the collective responsibility of their government, of their city, and indeed of the world.
Jun, you want to take that too?
Yes, for sure. I think survey after survey have shown that the young people in China have one of the highest, if not the highest, rate of awareness on the environment and even on climate change issues. But in the meantime, we have also seen that the younger generation have yet to translate all this awareness into real solid action. So it's very, very important for the government to create policies and mechanisms to help them making those greener choices on, green transportation, green consumption, and also for big business, to go green. All these big brands, they can green their supply chain in an unprecedented way because of the vast, improvement in environmental transparency and IT, new digital solutions.
Okay. Pradeep?
Yeah, I think two things. One is, if we look at the private sector, I think we are seeing a huge shift taking place based on the data that is coming out of the IMF, where the number of environment, social, and governance-related issues that are being raised among the asset management community is actually rising. More and more investors are looking to increase their investments in ESG investments from 2021 onwards. So this is an incredibly important issue because it's a reflection of the millennials as opposed to the baby boomers who are going to be dominating the world in the next 10 years. The other thing is really popular choice. We just conducted one of the largest popular surveys in the world, 1.2 million respondents, on checking on what the pulse was. And more than 64% understand that we are in the middle of a climate emergency. They recognize the need to invest in forests and land, to invest in solar, wind, and renewable energy, to invest in climate-friendly farming, green jobs and businesses. So the demand is out there. We just now need to ensure that is met.
Connect the dots, as they say. Thank you so much for the three of you. Pradeep, Maria, and Jun, really appreciate it. Hope the conference will be a great success. Thank you. You're watching World Insight. Coming up on the program, Myanmar's military leaders face striking civil servants and overseas sanctions. Is there still time for a peaceful resolution between protesters and the military? Welcome back. This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The situation in Myanmar has become global concern. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres condemned on Sunday the use of deadly violence in Myanmar, calling on all parties to respect election results and return to civilian rule. And Facebook announced it had deleted the military's main page. China has called on all parties to bring peaceful solution to the country. So what's next, and how can the country reconcile differences between different stakeholders? Let's loop in our panelists. They have very different perspectives. For more on the latest situation in Myanmar, we're joined in Kuala Lumpur, Bridget Welsh, Honorary Research Associate at the University of Nottingham's Asia Research Institute in Malaysia. Thank you for joining us. In Tokyo, Lin Tim Wai, Adjunct Research Fellow from National University of Singapore. Thank you. Last but not least, in Beijing, Song Qingren, Associate Professor from Beijing Foreign Studies University. Thank you for joining us as well. Let me start by asking about the latest development, particularly international community's reaction. From the UN Secretary General, we have heard the criticism of the violence that's going on. Ms. Welsh, how shall we see the possibility solutions to end the violence, to say the least?
The international community needs to engage the military in dialogue to make it clear that the use of violence against protesters and civilians is not the best way forward. This involves not only the international community, but also China.
China have been participating in the UN meeting regarding the Myanmar issue. Tell me more, since China is being mentioned here, Mr. Song, about your take, China's role, and fundamentally, what is the issue as China sees it?
Both China and some ASEAN countries and also other international, other foreign countries, they are trying their efforts to persuade the Myanmar military, the ARD, and also the some important NGO leaders in Myanmar to negotiate, to have dialogues. I think under their efforts, our joint efforts, both China and ASEAN, and also international society efforts, we hope that we can promote Myanmar's different parties to conduct dialogue as soon as possible.
Here's what the Chinese State Councilor Wang Yi said about Myanmar. Myanmar, quote, is a member of the ASEAN family, and its domestic situation bears on the building of the ASEAN community and blocks integration process. The problem should be resolved peacefully within its constitutional and legal framework, end of quote. So how are the ASEAN countries, or you're from Singapore originally, part of the ASEAN, looking at the issue? What can be the role of the ASEAN in this regard?
ASEAN as an organization wants to see a peaceful resolution. Some of its members have voiced stronger statements about the use of force. Most of the ASEAN members are worried about the repeat of the 1980s incidents or the Saffron Revolution in 2007. So ASEAN, as you know, works by consensus. So they have put out strong statements, but at the same time, they are also trying backdoor diplomacy, trying to get Myanmar back to the table to see if there are any negotiated solutions between the different stakeholders to lower the temperature.
Ms. Welsh, you see the incoming Biden administration has been quite obviously chosen the issue of Myanmar as one on its foreign policy agenda from the very beginning of its term. But many also wonder whether the approach about sanctions will really work. We have seen that being exercised by the United States elsewhere in the world. Whether that really helped to bring a solution or deepening the divide is a big question being debated. Ms. Welsh.
Well, I think the Biden administration didn't choose this. Unfortunately, they had to respond to the coup that happened in February. But I think what we're seeing are a very different type of approach by the Biden administration than previous governments in responding to Myanmar. The sanctions are somewhat lower in terms of the scope. They're focused on individuals and companies, and they're very modest in their actual range. But they are importantly targeted, in the sense that the Biden administration is coming into this situation recognizing that sanctions as a broad policy can actually hurt the Myanmar people. So they're focusing on specific individuals. And they are also working in a very different way, which is to collaborate with different allies and like-minded partners on the issues of Myanmar. I think strategically, the challenge is not to have the issue of what's happening in Myanmar be brought in and as part of a kind of competition between the U.S. or China, or actually affect other relationships. So I think that there has been some slow movement, but it has been a movement that the international community from the West has actually been very clear in sort of condemning what has happened and expressing a desire for dialogue and to lower the temperature has been spoken earlier, to reduce the pressure inside Myanmar on what is happening on the ground.
Right. Ms. Welsh, no offense here, but very interesting recent incidents, for example, in the Capitol in the U.S. and also some of the other issues going on about the pandemic and the protests against the pandemic's issues have been making the world a little bit skeptical, if not considering hypocritical, about the some of the Western countries' approach and double standards, shall we say, toward their own politics and the politics elsewhere in the world. So how do you think these governments will be able to overcome this skepticism in the world and play a role of constructive role, shall we say, in the issue of Myanmar?
I think it is correct that the United States has some very serious issues to deal with internally in terms of what's happened in the Capitol and also the legacy of the Trump administration. And I think also the same issues were relevant for China, the issues in terms of a constructive role. And I think what's important for the situation in Myanmar is how the United States and China and other international actors work to reduce the violence and the tension, because these are escalating. Not only have we seen deaths in terms of the protests, we're also seeing concerns about spillovers for rising ethnic conflict. So I think that skepticism is necessary, but I think that this should not blind us to the focus on trying to address some of the real issues in Myanmar itself, working collaboratively. And I think it is in the U.S. and China's interest together to have a solution that is peaceful in Myanmar.
Mr. Lim Ten Wai, Singapore is one of the largest single foreign investors for the year 2019 to 2020 fiscal year in Myanmar, if I get it right. Some of the latest numbers suggest the foreign investment, direct FDI, has been increasing dramatically in Myanmar since the country has been going through some peaceful period of time. For example, for the year 2012 to 2013, shot up to 1.4 billion in terms of foreign investment. And also from 2015 to 2016, almost 9.5 billion US dollars. Of course, this is helping the economy of Myanmar, also helping the community of ASEAN. And coming from Singapore yourself, how do you look at the issues of Myanmar be resolved peacefully so that the foreign investors will continue to invest there in Myanmar, which could be a great solution for the country's economy as well? Mr. Lim.
The investments from the top 3 investors in Myanmar has been very strategic in helping the CLMV country catch up with the ASEAN 6.
Explain,
CLMV
please.
meaning Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam, because they are the newer members of ASEAN. And so investments is definitely crucial in helping to close the gap between the CLMV countries and the ASEAN 6 countries which developed earlier. So in that sense, the top investors in Myanmar have been very useful in economic development and ASEAN integration. Of course, with the coup happening, many countries are now trying, especially ASEAN countries, are trying to bring Myanmar back into the negotiating table through a backdoor or front door diplomacy in order to persuade them that the priorities of economic development remains very important. And therefore, as you know, in December 2015, the ASEAN countries have come together to form the ASEAN Economic Community, AEC. The hope is that it can form a single market in the near future. And in fact, the process has already started. With more interdependency in economic exchanges, with more interdependency in trade exchanges and even technological exchanges, it is hope that all countries can play by the regional norms and convention. And so it remains to be seen how ASEAN countries can use innovative ways to diffuse this crisis, even if it's not resolution, at least turn down the temperature and prevent bloodshed.
The innovative way, Mr. Lim, would you like to elaborate a little bit more about what exactly are you trying to refer to?
ASEAN has used various methods, including corridor diplomacy during meetings, backdoor diplomacy, closed door diplomacy, soft power, gentle persuasion, and economic exchanges in order to diffuse crisis in the past.
China has been declared very clearly that it has good relationship both with the military in Myanmar and also with the political party, as well as Ms. Aung San Suu Kyi, who visited China several times over the past few years. So how is China going to be able to keep that balance among different factors inside Myanmar politics and bring the country together with others out of the current crisis?
Outsiders' actions or their policies on Myanmar now should not to exaggerate or escalate to make the Myanmar situation to be escalated. Constructive way is that the outsider actions, the international actors' actions, should be useful to resolve the Myanmar's intention. Should be useful to help Myanmar to stakeholders to conduct dialogues and reconciliation as soon as possible to help Myanmar to decrease the temperature of the situation.
How are countries relevant in this issue going to make their utmost effort to make sure Myanmar is not going to be a battleground of major powers, but rather an issue in which they could work together constructively to set a good precedence for the future? This is a very loaded question. I know it's a big one. Nobody has the solution now, but I do want to invite your expertise to begin with. Ms. Welsh.
In order to address these issues, you have to make sure that the dialogue is not just with Myanmar itself, but among the international players. And I think that it is a country that is facing an unprecedented political crisis from the perspective of the younger generation of people inside Myanmar, many of which are coming out onto the streets to protest. It is a situation where the country historically was seen to be moving forward towards economic development, some sort of political stabilization, a more open situation politically, and these things have really fundamentally changed. So it becomes an issue about the region because it involves the status of Asia when attention is being focused on a country such as Myanmar. And I think this is why there needs to be this kind of multiple third-party type of discussions between ASEAN and China, between the United States and China, in Japan, because Japan has a very good relationship in Myanmar longer term. And so I think that this involves multiple stakeholders.
Yeah, Mr. Song, what about from your perspective? How to make sure that this will be a good precedence set for resolving some of the most thorny issues in the world, particularly with major powers involved?
Now, different international stakeholders have different advantage in Myanmar issue. Mm-hmm. So now it's very urgent for different stakeholders to have dialogues or have consultations and to make joint efforts to persuade Myanmar's different stakeholders to get to the negotiation table to reach reconciliation. Now it needs the international society's joint efforts and quickly.
Is it happening?
Both the China and the ASEAN countries and also other stakeholders their officials have the telephone calls and exchange of views, and also ASEAN has said it wants to conduct a special foreign ministers meeting to talk about the Myanmar issue and to help Myanmar to resolve the terrible situation.
Mr. Lim, your take on that?
Yes, indeed. Fortunately, on this issue and this crisis, all international stakeholders appear to be on the same page. They use different methodologies to reach out to Myanmar. For example, in the case of Russia and China, they do have very good traditional relationship with the Tatmadaw, which is the Myanmarese military. In the case of Japan, it has very good economic relations with Myanmar. And you can see that the Japanese government have also mentioned that it is important not to isolate the government from the international community. Some of its private sector companies have also made symbolic withdrawals. In the case of ASEAN, as I mentioned before, a lot of corridor diplomacy, backdoor diplomacy. In the case of the US, which is playing a very important role as well, many in the region are relieved that the sanctions are targeted and limited.
I know it is a very important developing story in this part of the region, but for now I want to thank all of you for your insights and comparing notes, which is extremely important for the working spirit on the issue. Thank you so much, every one of you. Bridget Welsh, Lim Tan Wai, last but not least, Song Ching Ren. Really appreciate it. Thank you. That's the latest discussion about situations in Myanmar. And that's all the time also we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight, check out our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching.